So my name is David Randall, and I'm the founding chief editor of the Journal of Advances in Modeling Earth Systems, which is usually known as James. And I'm very happy to tell you a little bit about the origin story of James. Well, starting back around the year 2000, roughly, I began thinking that it would be useful to have a journal dedicated to all aspects of modeling the Earth system. I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I think about the atmosphere first, but coupled modeling is very important now for both climate and weather, and so oceanography and ice sheets and the solid Earth and everything. And this would include the concepts behind the models and the way the models are discretized for use on computers, and results obtained with the models and tests performed to evaluate the models. So all those different aspects. At the time, again, this is around 2000, I was the chief editor of the Journal of Climate, which is a journal of the American Meteorological Society. And I tried to persuade the AMS to create a modeling journal, but I failed. I also have felt for a long time that the concept of open access journals is very important. That's because, almost all of our research is supported by taxpayers' money. And it seems wrong to then ask the taxpayers to pay to read about it through subscriptions. And of course, I'm also aware that university libraries are being hurt very hard by constantly growing subscription fees that they can't afford. And I resent the idea that when my work is published in a journal, I have to sign away the copyright, as if I didn't do it. It's like I don't own it anymore. It just feels wrong. So for all those reasons, I wanted to see open access journals proliferate. And so obviously, if I was going to start a new journal, I would want to make it open access. So the two things that were missing were a home for modeling papers and open access. At the time, AGU published modeling papers in the Journal of Geophysical Research, of course, but they publish a lot of other things in there. It's a very, very broad list of subjects. And so, the modeling papers don't really have an identity there. It doesn't feel like a modeling community. And having a journal that's dedicated to modeling gives modelers a place to feel like they can call home. In the AMS at that time, a lot of modeling papers were published in the Monthly Weather Review. And the title of that journal is not a very good description of what actually appears in it, but the range of topics in that journal is extremely broad, again, just like JGR. And again, it just feels awkward to have to go to such a journal to find the work on modeling that a lot of us consider to be so important. Yes, so this is, I think, a very interesting story. I mean, of course, I'm biased, but in 2003, began writing a proposal for our National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center. And for those who don't know, those are among the largest awards that the National Science Foundation makes. At that time, it was $4 million a year for 5 years, renewable for 5 more years. And science and technology centers are very broad. They have a research focus, of course, but they also involve a strong educational component and a knowledge transfer component. So one of the elements of the knowledge transfer part of the proposal for this STC was proposal to create a new modeling journal. And I've already explained why I thought, such a journal was needed. So, I tried to get somebody else to do it and failed. So I decided, okay, here's my chance. I'm writing this big proposal. There's money in here that could be used for this, and it fits with the knowledge transfer angle. So let's go ahead and write it in. And I did. And of course, if I go back today and read what I wrote then, it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly describe what James turned out to be. Certainly there's no mention of the AGU or any other society at that point. But the basic idea is there. So long story short, the STC, which is called CMAP, the Center for Multi-Scale Modeling of Atmospheric Processes, was funded starting in the summer of 2006. And we had mandate to go out and create a new journal. So we did, and we had a contest to name the journal. If you when I go back and read what I wrote in 2003 and 4, the name I had in mind at the time was Journal of Global Environmental Modeling. We would call it GEM, GEM. Eventually, we had a contest at a party to name what turned out to be James. And the name was proposed by one of my former students whose first name happens to be James. So that was fun. The journal began publication in 2009. And so that was about 3 years after the CMAP funding started. And there were many issues to be overcome, obviously. And one of the first ones was the business plan. So the question is how to make this work financially. The STC would be there for 5 years or possibly 10. It was 10 eventually. But you don't want the STC or its legacy in the university to be the long-term publisher of a journal. So the idea was that the STC would basically plant the seed and nourish it while it was small, and then hand off to another entity. And at the time, we had no idea that the other entity would be AGU. Second issue was finding the right person to create the infrastructure, which is largely software infrastructure, and manage it. And the guy who did that is Roger Ames. He was the knowledge transfer manager for CMAP, and he was just terrific. So he found appropriate open access, open source software out on the internet, open source software for running a journal. And he downloaded it and set it up, and we had a server for it to run on. So that worked. Another big issue, of course, at the beginning was finding people to publish papers in this thing, which is brand new. And you wonder, brand new journal, how do I know that the work I publish here will actually be seen by anybody? And what helped there was the Science and Technology Center. It was a large team of people, something in the neighborhood of 80 or so people total, including students. And they were, many of them, willing to submit papers to James, despite the understandable uncertainty that anybody might have at that stage of the game. And this included some very well-known scientists. I'll just mention a few names. Kerry Emanuel, Chris Bretherton, Akio Arakawa, and a bunch of other people who are extremely well known were kind enough to submit papers to James during those early years. And then other people see that they're publishing there, so it must be okay. And the papers started coming in. And this even before we had contact with AGU. So I got a phone call out of the blue from AGU in August or September of 2009. I think the call came from Barbara Major, and so she expressed interest on the part of AGU in James and wanted to have a conversation about it. So we set up a meeting, and that meeting occurred on December 1st of 2009 at AGU headquarters in Washington. I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself here. I mentioned the business model, but let me go back and finish that thought. You can imagine that it would be a nightmare to try to bill authors for page charges through a large state university, which is where I work. So that idea, that was a non-starter, but obviously somebody has to do the billing. So what we wanted to do is find an entity outside the university that could serve as essentially the publisher of the journal. And so I thought briefly about creating a new nonprofit for that purpose, but then I realized that I knew some people who already had a nonprofit that could be used for this, and that nonprofit is IGS, which is the Institute for Global Environment and Society, run by Jagadish Shukla and Jim Kinter. So I reached out to them. I knew these guys for a long time, reached out to them and explained the situation, said I was looking for someone to publish this new journal that the SGC was creating, and they agreed to do it. So for about the first, let me think, from sometime in the summer of 2009 until late 2010, IGES was the publisher of James. And obviously I'm very grateful to them for taking that on. So the way it would work is, submissions to the journal would come to my offices at Colorado State University, and we would process the submissions, and at the point where we actually accepted an article, we would pass it off to IGS, and they would handle the financial side of things, and including actually billing the author in the end for page charges. And they involved some other parties in this process, some publishing offices, but basically that was at arm's length, at least once removed from CMAP and my work at CSU. So I didn't really have very much contact with that. But that's how it worked until ultimately AGU actually began publishing. The announcement of James as a new journal by AGU occurred at the fall AGU meeting in 2010. And I was there, and there was a cake one of the coffee breaks in the afternoon. And so sort of a little party. But that's when AGU actually took over. And I will say, when AGU first contacted me to talk about their interest in James, I was a little nervous about it because, this was my baby, and I didn't want to lose control of it. Now, in retrospect, this is 10 years later, it's obvious that that AGU contacting us and expressing interest in essentially taking over James was the best thing that could possibly have happened. There's no question about that. It was wonderful. But when it first happened, I was a little nervous. But I got over it. And I think that meeting in Washington on December 1st, 2009 was a big part of what helped me get over it. The early discussions included, co-publishing between AGU and CMAP or IGES. And of course, we ultimately did not do that. We simply handed the journal over. I worried that maybe AGU would, drastically change it and, wouldn't be open access anymore, or they would drastically increase the page charges, or the focus of the journal would change in some way, or they wouldn't let me be the editor anymore. And none of that happened. I shouldn't have worried. It was all fine. So ultimately, everything worked out, and I was quite pleased with the result. Yeah, people told me, actually, I shouldn't say people told me. People said, not necessarily to my face at the time, back in the early 2000s, that this was a crazy idea. And I have to admit, in retrospect, it was a crazy idea to create a journal in a university like that with funding from a science and technology center. But it worked. And without the intercession of AGU, I think it might not have worked. But ultimately, it turned out just fine. So I think I was extremely lucky, or James was extremely lucky when AGU came along and took it over. Well, you probably ought to ask Robert Pincus, who's currently the chief editor for, I think, a short time to come. And whoever replaces him as the new chief editor after, I don't know the name at this point. But I hope that the journal can broaden a bit further. At this point, you don't see a lot of articles dealing with certainly the solid Earth or continental ice sheets. There's not a lot about ecology, which is kind of an earth science and certainly is being included in many of the models these days, climate models. So I think there's room to broaden the journal in that way. And I'd also like to see more papers dealing with the numerical methods that are used in the models. There are some now, but I'd like to see more. It's a pretty important part of what modeling is all about. I'm very happy that Robert Pincus has worked to organize the publication of many model descriptions in James over the last several years. The new models, there are models that are being used in the latest round of CMIP calculations for the new IPCC report, and a lot of those model descriptions have been published in James, and that's a great thing. It's really wonderful what he's done there. I think it's pretty clear that open access is going to take over the world. It hasn't yet, but it's definitely moving in that direction. There are more and more mandates from funding entities, both public and private, to publish openly immediately, and I think that's a wonderful thing. AGU has certainly been ahead of the game here, but there's certainly room for AGU to move further, and I think they will. I think they really will have no choice. So I think the future of scientific publishing is open access. I have published a couple of books myself. I mean, this is slightly off the subject, but in this day and age with our current technology, it's not clear to me that publishing a book through a conventional publisher is the best way to reach my audience. I'm not going to make any money from the book anyway. The kind of thing I write, the volume of sales is not very large, so that's not really a consideration. If I publish my book online, open access with a Creative Commons license of some kind to protect myself so somebody else doesn't sell it, I think, first of all, everybody can get it for free, so that's good. And secondly, I can change it anytime I want. I don't need anybody's permission to have a second edition or a second printing or anything like that. I can just go change it as needed. Sort of the way Tesla changes their cars. They put out an update whenever they got one ready. So I think that's the future, and probably not just for journals, maybe also for books that serve small technical audiences like graduate student textbooks and that kind of thing. Uh, well, first of all, they should submit their modeling papers to James, okay? And Robert Pincus and I were discussing this interview. I told him about it, and he said one of his comments was that James is based on the idea that models are ideas, not widgets. And of course, I strongly believe that. In fact, to me, it doesn't even need to be said. But there are people out there in the world who think of models as just sort of software gadgets that lack conceptual content, and they are wrong, wrong, wrong. And I urge young people to look into it and see for themselves that models are much more than just computational tools. And I guess the other lesson from the story of James is that crazy ideas, maybe foolhardy ideas, sometimes work out well, but it helps to be lucky, like I was. And so I would encourage young people to go ahead and stick their names out or their necks out when they feel strongly that something should be done and they can't get somebody else to do it. Well, do it yourself if you can. I would just like to thank Roger Ames, Jim Kinter, Robert Pincus, and the AGU for everything they've done for James. It's been wonderful, and it's really one of the best things that's happened to me, I think, in my life is this experience. It's been quite good.